Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 259 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you ask someone on the street if they've heard of Charlemagne, the answer is probably going to be yes. But if you ask what Charlemagne actually did to be known as Charles the Great, the answers might not be so confident, even in medieval studies departments. So, what's so great about Charlemagne? Well, we're about to find out. This week, I spoke with Dr. Cullen Chandler about the reign of Charles the Great, aka Charlemagne. Cullen is the Frank and Helen Lowry Professor of History at Lycoming College and the author of Carolingian Catalonia, Politics, Culture, and Identity in an Imperial Province 778 to 987, alongside his other work on the Carolingian Empire and early medieval food. His new book is Introduction to the Carolingian Age. Our conversation on how Charlemagne managed such a massive empire, what his greatest legacy is, and how he managed to still care about things like font is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Cullen, to the podcast to tell us all about Charlemagne. It is so great to meet you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so Charlemagne, we're giving him his own podcast this time. I did mention him when I was speaking with Justine Fernhofer-Baker about kings, but let's talk about this guy because he's Charles the Great. He deserves an episode, right?
Yes, I'm glad to represent Charlemagne. I think he deserves to be more well known than he is, and to the extent that people already know about him, they deserve to know more.
Yeah, I think he's one of these people that you're like, yeah, I've heard that name. I kind of have a visual of this guy in like a cape or something. He's kind of this time period. We don't know. But of course, he's so influential in all aspects of his time that we really need to talk about him. So get us there, time and place. Where are we talking about and when are we talking about?
We are talking about the Frankish kingdom in the 8th and 9th centuries. So the Frankish kingdom became kind of, in a way, France, but in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was more than just France. So Charlemagne's kingdom, by the time he took over the sole rule in 771, was most of what is today France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Liechtenstein. I can't forget Liechtenstein. He took over other areas in Saxony, so that would be northwestern Germany today, the northern, almost half of Italy, and a little bit into Spain as well. So you say the Frankish kingdom, the Franks became France, but it's really a much larger space than that, taking up a good part of Western Europe.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge. And you say in the book, the most striking aspect of the Carolingian Empire was its unity. And this is the most striking aspect. So how do you have such a vast empire at a time when things are getting fragmented? So we've gone, and you start in the book from late antiquity. We've gone from the Roman Empire in its classic form to a whole bunch of kingdoms. And now we're looking at sort of an empire now. How does this happen?
Yeah, that's the question, I think. And the best we can tell is that I think early medieval kings didn't try to micromanage everything, right? They created relationships with other members of the elite social classes in the regions that they wanted to control, in the localities that they wanted to control. And Charlemagne in particular, as my students would say, had riz, right? He had a certain level of charisma, and he could draw people to him. So you can appoint counts, right? The main secular aristocrats were counts, and they generally had to come from aristocratic families, but they earned some level of prestige and status by their association with the king that they could use as social capital back in their localities and their regions. And then the king then had a loyal kind of conduit of his authority down to the local level. So I think most people, common people in the time of Charlemagne, so the late 700s, early 800s, they wouldn't necessarily have had much occasion to think about Charlemagne, their king, like what's he going to do, because the count would have been taking care of most of the business that pertained to them. And there were hundreds of these guys. There were hundreds of counts and also bishops, right? So bishops were important as church figures, but it's important for modern people to remember that they were also important administrators of the kingdom. And both sets of these people had meetings, right? They had assemblies every year where most people, if they could reasonably travel the distance to the assembly point, which was not always in the same place every year, they would go there, they'd mingle together, they'd talk to their peers, and then they'd have meetings where the king would be present. Bishops were there as well as counts. Some abbots of monasteries. Monasteries were also key landholders, and a lot of the most important monasteries found themselves under the protection of Charlemagne and the royal family, which meant that they were kind of an arm of the royal administration in that regard. Mm-hmm. The bishops and abbots also met at church councils. I like going to conferences, seeing what is going on in my field, meeting people I haven't seen since the last conference. And it's the same for the counts at the assemblies. It's the same for the bishops and the abbots at the church councils. And also they made laws at these places, right? Mm-hmm. And so everybody meets, they discuss whatever the issues are, whether it's religious or secular, and they write the laws about them called capitularies. We have a lot of capitularies, or written documents that reflect the laws, and probably different copies were made and distributed to the different regions of the kingdom, and people could stick to the letter of the law, right? So it's kind of a thin layer of really quite personal networks that kept the empire together. And then you have the missi, right? The missi dominici, right? It means the Lord King's envoys. And Charlemagne would pick these people, and they would travel about, and they would visit your area where you're in charge. And they was, well, are you keeping up with what the capitularies say you're supposed to be keeping up with? Are you allowing yourself to be bribed by anyone? Are you upholding justice? Are you following the laws? And there could be sometimes repercussions. I've never seen direct evidence of a lot of people being like fired from their jobs, being removed as count or something. That did happen. Some people were removed, but mostly that's a great treason against the king himself would get you kicked out. So it's a thin layer of personal relationships, kind of reinforced by written laws and by traveling agents of the king to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these relationships between people and towns and all of that idea of a structure of things, news, information moving back and forth, it doesn't just end with the Roman Empire. Like, I think sometimes the way things have been structured in history, especially in the 19th century, talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, like an asteroid hit and everything is like zombie apocalypse, but it's not like that, in that people are still communicating. Right. So then when you get someone at the top who's got the riz, it can all come together. So he's got this empire and it's working pretty well. He's got the counts on side and stuff like that, but he also expands in certain directions. Why is he doing this? Does he just want more territory? Like, how does he end up, for example, expanding into Saxony or attempting to expand into what's now Spain? How does this happen?
Yeah, I think there are several answers to that, or at least a few. What I tell my students is that on one hand, the Frankish king had to be a war leader. You have to be able to keep your followers loyal, not just because of your personal charisma or whatever personal qualities you might have, but they're in it for stuff too, right? Mm-hmm. These people are wealthy individuals and they want to stay that way. They want to increase their wealth when they can. And the king is supposed to provide an avenue for doing that. It's not unlike the kind of culture you see in stories like Beowulf, where, they have this warrior ethos. The aristocrats were the warriors. That's what they were trained to do from youth. Even in the life of Charlemagne by the biographer Einhard, he makes a note that Charlemagne taught his sons how to ride horses and use weapons. So war is something that you're just expected to do. It's part of being an adult aristocratic or royal man. The second part of that is that through war, you can get rich.
Mm-hmm.
So they did take over places like Saxony. They took over the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy, and they defeated the Avars in Central Europe. And I wouldn't really say that they took over the territory, because that's kind of far away from where their headquarters were. It would have been hard to maintain that territory. But they got a lot of loot, because the Avars had been plundering the Byzantine Empire or receiving tribute from the Byzantine Empire and others for hundreds of years. And so if you participate in the wars, maybe you'll be appointed count of a new place. Maybe you'll get a cut of the loot. So there's the warrior ethos, there's the plunder, the tribute, all this kind of stuff, at least for the aristocratic elite. And then I think there is a religious aspect to Charlemagne's wars and to a lot that Charlemagne did. Sometimes I talk to people and they have the attitude that, well, ancient or medieval rulers, quote, used religion as a tool to enforce their authority.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, they did. But I also think we have to leave room for their actual genuine belief.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Charlemagne actually genuinely believed that he's supposed to help turn as many people Christian as he can. Saxons were not Christian. Saxons were also a nuisance for generations in that part of the Frankish kingdom. And so he could kind of get the 2-for-1. He could eliminate a military problem that had been plaguing him and his ancestors for a long time, and also bring new Christians into the fold. He did so very, very brutally, right? There were massacres and deportations and what we called in the 90s ethnic cleansing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a rosy picture, but he did that. Charlemagne saw himself as the protector for Christians all over, quote, the world, right? He sent a mission to Jerusalem to help materially with building and maintaining churches in and around Jerusalem. And I think that also explains some of the motivation for invading Spain, because Spain in the 700s was largely controlled by Muslim rulers. And even in the northeastern part of the peninsula where he invaded in 778, he was, in a sense, liberating the Christians who lived in those regions from their supposedly oppressive Muslim overlords. And I think even with fighting the Lombards, there's maybe a weak religious justification for that, because the Lombards and the popes did not get along. And the Pope was Charlemagne's ally. And so he fought the Lombards to save the Pope and his territory from the Lombard threats.
Yes, and forevermore, that region of Europe is associated with holiness, with the most Christianness, with Holy Roman Empire type stuff, which is to distinguish itself. I like how later in the book you talk about Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, trying to politically say, I am the Roman Empire, but also not, because there's still Roman Empire in Byzantium. But yeah, this idea of holiness is forever associated with France and the German regions that were once part of the Carolingian Empire, right?
Right. Louis the Pious in particular. Well, no, let's back up.
Okay.
When I talk to people about Charlemagne, I use the image that his business card kept having to get larger and larger and larger to accept the new titles that he took on.
Mm-hmm.
Because he started as King of the Franks. right? Charles, by the grace of God, King of the Franks. Okay, fine. They had this alliance with the popes going back to at least Charlemagne's father, Pippin, after whom I named a cat. So one of my cats is Pippin. He's Pippin, known as Pippin the Short, and this cat was kind of small, so we called him Pippin. I could go on about the cat because we got another cat at the same time that we named Mary, and so we tell people that Mary and Pippin the cats are named after Mary and Pippin the hobbits, but I named the first cat Pippin after Charlemagne's father.
That's right. I'm geeky, but I'm actually more geeky than you think, right? I just don't want to tell people that.
That's yeah. You gotta, we have to look like we know what we're doing. And so,
well, you're outed for the rest of the world now.
Well, there we go. But Pippin, Charlemagne's father, also forged an alliance with a series of popes, and they, in fact, helped provide him the justification for usurping the throne and becoming king himself in 751. So the popes named Pippin and his family as patricians of the Romans. So Charlemagne's business card is now King of the Franks and Patrician of the Romans. When he completed the conquest of the Lombard kingdom in 774, he didn't simply annex that kingdom to his own. He became King of the Franks and of the Lombards and Patrician of the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
When he had the imperial title, you can see one of my favorite images in the book is a coin he had made after he was emperor, and it says Charles Emperor Augustus, and it shows him looking kind of like a Roman emperor with a toga-looking garment and a laurel crown, right? Which he never actually wore, as far as we know. But then he's Emperor Augustus governing the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Right? So he's King of the Franks and of the Lombards, Patrician of the Romans, and Emperor Augustus governing the Roman Empire. Right? He never called himself like Emperor of the Romans or Roman Emperor. In part because there was an empire in the East. Luckily, around 800, when Charlemagne was crowned, the emperor was not in place, and instead there was an empress. So as a woman, she could be disqualified for the Pope's purposes and for Charlemagne's purposes.
Mm-hmm.
His son Louis, known as Louis the Pious, kind of dispensed with the A4 sized business card and just started going by emperor. And he conceived of the emperor as being a Christian empire. So not quite the so-called Holy Roman Empire of later, but very determinedly a Christian empire. And you see documents from Louis' time saying he's the most pious, most serene, august emperor, which I think is kind of a cool, the most serene. I think
yeah.
If we could have politicians just vying to see who could be most serene nowadays, I think that'd be a win for everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be win if it was like a little bit serene. Kind of serene, kind of serene. That'd be a step in the right direction.
Mildly to moderately serene would be good.
All right, so coming back to the Christian aspect of this is so important. And I think something that is definitely not unique to this period because things are shifting and always morphing all the time. But there is a real sense that as the emperor, even though Charlemagne's not a churchman, that he has the authority to influence the church in ways that they were just not into much later in the medieval period. And what I'm thinking of now is the way he set out rules for the monastic community and the way people are being educated and all that. So can you get into how Charlemagne sort of dictated or shaped or changed the way that religion was practiced within his empire?
Yeah, I think for one thing, Charlemagne was very interested in the Christian religion, and he wanted to get it right. When I was first learning about Charlemagne back in the 1900s, the line was that he wanted to enforce, and not, that might be too strong a word, but basically he wanted to enforce uniformity. And he wrote to the Pope and he said, give us the best set of rules for Christianity. And so the Pope said, okay, well, here's what we've been doing, right? Because the Pope's version of Christianity would probably be better than anybody else's. I have to stress to people, whether in my classes or just like later today, I have a reception with some people to go to. Like, well, the Pope was not the Pope, right? The later medieval idea of like Pope Innocent III trying to give orders to kings was not going to fly. Even in the years after 800, when the Pope put the crown on Charlemagne's head, right? But as somebody who is a resource person, a source of information, authoritative information, the Pope would be the choice, right? And that's in part because in different regions during late antiquity and the very early Middle Ages, the Pope had even less influence. And so you get to see these regional practices that developed. For example, in Ireland, and then as that moved into England in the 7th century, they had the Synod of Whitby to decide these kinds of things, right? The Irish influence came into the Frankish kingdom in the Merovingian period as well. So you have all of these similar Christian traditions, but Charlemagne wants to say, well, what's the best path forward? He had a series of church councils. He had a whole entourage of religious advisors, but I think it was, to put it in a modern form of thinking about things, it was an international cast of characters. The initial set of advisors that Charlemagne had, Alcuin of York from England, or Theodulf of Orleans, right? He was Bishop of Orleans in his career, but he was from Spain originally. Or Paulinus of Aquileia, right? He's from northern Italy. Or Peter of Pisa, right, from Italy. And so Charlemagne wasn't trying to impose his version of Christianity, because first he had to figure out what is the best version of Christianity that we can try to advocate for. And even then, the rules that he put out said more along the lines of, we want to correctly read authoritative texts. But if you had different texts available to you than what Charlemagne had at the royal court, as long as they're authoritative, they're fine. So he didn't actually try to impose uniformity as I had been taught, but he just wanted to have everybody on the same team, right? So you look at things in the 8th century, Bishop Hrotagang of Metz wrote a rule for canons. So canons are people who live at the cathedral church. Their boss is the bishop, but they live more or less like monks. And so they needed a rule. And there were a lot of rules. So Bishop Hrotagang wrote one and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Now, he had connections to the Carolingian family. And so Bishop Hrotagang's rule, that's the ideal, right? But they also recognize that not everybody can have a copy of the rule, because these things are made by hand on parchment and it's not easily mass produced. For monks, it seems that Charlemagne favored the rule of Saint Benedict, and so he wanted to promote that. But even then, he couldn't snap his fingers and have every monastery in this pretty large empire immediately adopt the rule of Saint Benedict if they had been using something else before. Mm-hmm. Under Louis the Pious, they made more progress on that route, thanks to Louis's religious advisor, also named Benedict of Anian, right? And so he had an updated rule of Benedict that he could use. So on one hand, Charlemagne was very interested in Christianity. He wanted to do it right because he saw himself as responsible for the salvation of the souls of the people in his kingdom. So that's something to take very seriously. So he wanted to get Christianity right. But then when you look at what the rules are that actually came from that effort, there's still a lot of wiggle room for varying local and regional practices.
Yeah, I mean, it's essential. When you have that big an empire and you can't really enforce it, one of the things you mentioned is there's no standing army or police force or anything at this time. If you need an army, you need to call it up from, each individual count's lands and all of that stuff. So, but I think that the effort is very interesting. I remember working with the Rule of St. Benedict for my book on monks, and I was working with the Dumbarton Oaks edition, which is translated by Bruce Vennard, I think. And at the end, he has a letter that was written to Charlemagne explaining, well, when we talk about the bread that we have this much. And when we're talking about how much beer we get each day, we have this much. And like that attention to detail, it's being asked, why do we do this? Why do you do this? And having that explained, I think that attention to detail is a very interesting part of Charlemagne's project, if not what we can know about the man himself, which is just about nothing.
Right.
But I feel like this is a very curious man who's not only trying to administer well, but to understand the reasons why people are doing what they're doing already.
Mm-hmm. I think he was very curious. I like how you said about the Rule of Benedict and the daily rations of bread and wine and things, because I think Charlemagne could take his cue from texts like that, because the Rule of Benedict also makes allowances for the very old or the very young or brothers who are sick, right? If you're ill, then you can have a little bit more food so that your body can recover, right? And I think Charlemagne is informed by that kind of thinking. Here's the rule, and we're all going to live by the rule, but if you can't, then that's okay. Try to do the best you can, and if you can't, then we'll find a way to make it work. I agree. He was a very curious person. He wanted all the laws written down. So some of the so-called barbarian law codes that are first put into Latin, maybe they existed in written form before Charlemagne's time, but a lot of them, the manuscripts at least, that have the oldest copies of the law codes are from the Carolingian period. He wanted the old stories in the vernacular Frankish language written down. I was just talking to somebody, a student of mine yesterday, and said that it's really interesting that Charlemagne wanted the months and the days of the week to have Germanic style names. And so he's very interested in his own culture, right? The different aspects of his own culture, whether it's the Christian version or the Frankish version and these kind of things. And my student observed that the month for February, I think it was, is Hornung, and that's when deer shed their antlers, right? Yeah. Their horns. Yeah. And so it's really cool that they're naming the months by these natural phenomena. So that shows an interest in the biology of these wild animals and in the culture of tracking and hunting these animals. And in this kind of program, like, well, we're all going to use these names for these times of year and all that kind of thing. Charlemagne was also interested in astronomy. He paid attention to comets and eclipses and things like that, and actually asked his learned advisors on the meanings of these things. Now, of course, we would ask an actual astronomer, like Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody, and he could explain, well, it's because this comet always comes around every however many years or something like that. And of course, they saw in these celestial events messages from God, right? So God put these things in place, and humans are trying to understand them not as astronomical phenomena, but as religious messaging from God, right? And even in Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, when he gets toward the end and Charlemagne is increasingly old and increasingly sick, Einhard mentions that a comet was visible in the sky. And usually that's bad news, right? It's a portent of some kind of ominous development. And then however many days later, when Charlemagne actually died, now you know the full meaning of the comet, because that's the bad news the comet was announcing, right? So, yeah, I think Charlemagne was a very curious person. He wanted books read to him. He talked to very well educated people, very learned people, and he wanted all kinds of things done that were culturally significant, as well as politically or militarily or ecclesiastically significant.
Yeah, bringing these things all together, making sure there's records. And one of the things that I really respect in this guy is his attention to font.
Yes.
Because if you ever read a medieval manuscript, some of them are absolutely brutal, but Charlemagne was like, I can't read this. He probably couldn't read himself anyway, but he's like, how can anyone read this? We need to fix our font. So when people talk about Carolingian font, what are they talking about?
There is a reason I specialize in the study of the Carolingian period. And it's because I can't read the documents from before or after. That's a bit of an exaggeration, of course. I'm very learned in very, very many medieval scripts.
Yes, there's patches on your elbows, I'm sure.
Yeah, this jacket, no. The other one, I almost put the one on today. But yeah, it's hard to read this stuff.
Yeah.
People out there who think, oh, all you do is look stuff up in books and draw conclusions. Well, I mean, yes, but sometimes you look at the actual medieval manuscripts, you have to learn how to read those things. I remember even when I was growing up, we would read the Declaration of Independence by the American colonists. And I asked my dad, what is Congress? Right? Because the first S is the long S.
Yeah.
A Carolingian style S. And so you have to learn the shapes of the letters and things. The Carolingians get credit for just the legibility of their letters, the shapes of which are largely the same as the shapes that we use for our letters today, right? With some modifications, especially by Renaissance humanists. But the Renaissance humanists, when they wanted to make script more legible from the late medieval versions, they looked back to the Carolingian script, the Caroline minuscule, and their humanist script was based more on that. So that's how it gets transmitted to us. So it's the legibility of the script. It's not using capital letters all the time, like a lot of older writing would have. And it's also, get this, spaces in between words.
I know. What?
And you tell people this, you're like, well, haven't they always? No, spaces in between words had to be invented. Not by Charlemagne himself necessarily, but by the people working under the environment that he helped to foster, right? And if you pay careful attention here and there, you can start to see markings like we might call punctuation emerge. Sometimes it doesn't compute the way you think, oh, well, this means a period, full stop. This means a comma, or sometimes it's not like that. And sometimes something that, well, sometimes almost all the time, something that looks like a semicolon to us is actually an abbreviation for missing letters, right? These kinds of things. But they did make writing in a form that was legible, so legible that modern people can figure out, if they don't know the Latin, they can at least understand most of the letters. And that was a process of trial and error too, because in the course of my earlier research, I was looking at medieval manuscripts in Spain, and I have the Visigothic version of handwriting, which was okay. It was legible, but it had some wacky looking characteristics, like a lowercase a that looks like a modern lowercase u, right? It's open at the top. And things like that. And they had the late Merovingian, early Carolingian Corby script, called the A-B script, because the letters A and B are very distinctive looking in that form of handwriting. And, Charlemagne and his people had to decide, you know what? We're going with this. We're going with this new version of script. And you can tell, if you're better than I am at these things, at paleography, you can tell when and about when and where a certain manuscript was made based on the form of handwriting. Even the minor variations within the script that we would call Caroline minuscule, right? And you can say, oh, well, this is late 8th century northern France, and this is early 9th century northern Italy. And you can tell the difference because of the different traditions of how to form the letters. But yeah, I think that's probably the most mundane but the most important legacy of the Carolingian age is lowercase letters.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that you might not ever notice or realize until you are in a paleography class or facing a stack of medieval manuscripts and you're like, ah, these ones. I'm going to read these ones because you
Yeah,
can
I
actually
started
read them.
learning these things. I'm like, you know what? You know what? I am gonna do the 8th and 9th century. Thank you. I have found my home. And then the problem, as I later found out, is even when you're studying the 8th and 9th centuries, sometimes the text that you need is preserved only in a later copy. And so then you have to learn the later handwriting anyway. So
Oh,
yeah,
shucks.
I thought I was clever.
You almost got away with it. So,
Almost.
this idea of font, this idea of bringing everything together culturally in terms of the best versions of the best books we can get, to me, it all speaks to legacy, right? This is planning for the future. So, as we get to the end of this, as we start to wrap up, what do you think Charlemagne's legacy has been? Because there's lots of people who will look at it and say, make France great again. It should be all of Europe. But what do you think that some of, or maybe the best legacy of
Hmm.
Charlemagne is? Big question. Big question.
Yeah, that's a huge one because I think a lot of what Charlemagne did, he basically made up as he went.
Mm-hmm.
I started to think that, like, way back, even as I was working on my PhD, there was a curious thing that an earlier professor had pointed out to me about these people called the Hispani coming into the far southern areas of France, or the areas in Spain that Charlemagne had conquered. And he hadn't conquered a whole lot by 780-ish when these people were coming into these territories. And they seem to be getting privileged legal status in terms of how, you can't force them to pay taxes of certain kinds, and they get to judge each other according to their own legal traditions rather than by the law that the count would go by or something like this. And so I was trying to figure out why that is. And the conclusion I came up with is that, well, you got to do something. These people are coming in, so you have to find somehow to deal with these people. But you also have certain areas in the land where nobody had been working or farming on them for a while. And so you can say, hey, you guys want this land? All right, it's yours. Awesome. Right? Or sometimes they might even have moved there and started working on the land anyway, and it's just a royal recognition of that fact.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get to be under royal protection, which exempts you from these other things. That wasn't a plan. Charlemagne didn't lead the army into Spain and then think, okay, well, when we come through here, it's going to disrupt a lot of lifestyle things for people, and they're going to flee to our areas that we already have under firm control. And when that happens, then I'm going to hit them with this royal protection thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think his method was flexibility. And there's a whole book, if you want another episode on Charlemagne. Jennifer Davis's book, Charlemagne's Practice of Empire, is basically laying out in way more examples than I had found through my research that Charlemagne made stuff up. He looked around for ways that people had solved problems in the past, or what they're doing in Italy. Hey, maybe that'll work in Saxony, or whatever the case may be. I like that because I'm bad at planning. And so seeing somebody who is able to build and hold together this massive European empire, almost kind of winging it, I think that gives hope to somebody like me, right? And of course, he had a lot of advisors, very experienced, very well educated, smart people giving him advice all the time too, right? And so he doesn't do this alone, right? He has this hundreds and hundreds of people helping him all along the way. So in terms of like actual legacy, I think in some ways the Carolingian period is when a European type culture coalesced. So before, maybe it was part Visigothic or part Merovingian era Frankish and part Roman. You have some English and Irish influences, whatever kind of thing. Obviously, they were all officially Christian, but they were happy to just oversimplifying things into people who are specialists in these areas because it's not like that at all, right? But they didn't, the Franks didn't try to conquer the Visigoths and make the Visigoths do Frankish version of Christianity, right? That was one of the controversies during Charlemagne's reign, is what to do with these ideas coming out of Spain about adoptionism. And, well, that's a heresy and that's not allowed. But the books that they were using to come up with their ideas were allowed, because it was Augustine of Hippo. It was St. Augustine, and it was the Bible, right? You can't get more authoritative than the Bible and St. Augustine. So it's not like they were all just kind of there. And then Charlemagne came in and kind of gave impetus to this notion of we all should more or less be part of one mega culture, right? And the way you do things in your neck of the woods is fine, as long as it doesn't violate our fundamental rules. And I think that's probably the most important legacy, is something that might be called a common foundation for a broad European culture. And then one of the influential books when I was in college was Bartlett's The Making of Europe. And that's kind of the thesis there, is that this European culture spread from what had been the Carolingian heartlands into other areas in Europe, going farther east or farther south or farther north even. And so I think that's probably the thing that Charlemagne and the people of his time left, was the foundation for what would become a European culture.
Well, that is a big legacy. I guess he can keep the title the Great, right? We can still call him
Right.
Charles the Great.
Charles the Pretty Good. Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
Well, thank you so much, Cullen, for coming on and telling us why Charlemagne was great. I've really appreciated it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, great. It's been fun.
To find out more about Cullen's work, you can visit his faculty page at Lycoming College. His new book is Introduction to the Carolingian Age. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have a really fun piece about what medieval kingdoms really called themselves.
Ooh.
We all call places like the Byzantine Empire, the Carolingians, or the Holy Roman Empire, but they actually never really went by those names, or those are kind of mostly historians like us say, hey, we have to figure out what to call you.
Mm-hmm.
So the Byzantines, Carolingians, Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottomans all call themselves Romans.
Well, yeah, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be a Roman in those days? And these days.
Yeah, I mentioned like, hey, take me to the ruler of the Carolingian Empire. And I said, well, I don't know what that is. But I can take you to the Romans. We're all Romans here.
Yeah, exactly.
In northern France. And also we had fun parts like, how Ireland and Scotland were both called Scotland or Scotia. So for a long, long time, Scotland won out on that. So we've got that. Plus, we have a story about a 6th century earthquake machine in Constantinople.
Wow.
The short story is there was 2 neighbors. So like one lived above the other. The one downstairs was Anthemius, the architect. And one above him was Zeno, the lawyer. And they had a dispute for some reason. Zeno won in court, and Anthemius got revenge. And he built what appears to be a steam-powered earthquake machine to rattle his neighbor upstairs every once in a while.
Nice.
So people were quite interested in this little contraption. So it wasn't a little one. It seemed like he took up the whole room just building this thing. So he did that. And plus he did a thunder and lightning machine as well.
Just as an added touch.
Yeah, just to, be a bad neighbor, I guess. Get revenge.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got that story, plus police corruption in the Middle Ages. I can't believe that happened. And we also have a story of a person who found in the trash an early 16th century drawing. And it's just sold for over £20,000 at auction.
Wow. It's going to make everyone look more closely at their garbage, I suppose.
Yes. You should visit your local garbage dump and see what medieval remains there are.
Well, here in Canada, maybe not so much. But
Maybe not so much here.
well, thanks, Peter, for coming on and telling us what's on the website and what's in the garbage dump.
Thanks.
A big shout out to all of you out there making my work possible, whether that's letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist t-shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com. You can listen to the Medieval Podcast ad-free on Patreon for less than the cost of your annual pumpkin spice latte. So if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help me keep it going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Charles to churls, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.